I think it is fair to say that a primary preoccupation in the modern era, particularly for men and women in the 20 to 50 or so age bracket, is wealth accumulation. For most, it is the motivation to be able to provide one's needs in times of stress, and as one moves towards retirement, to have sufficient wealth to maintain a satisfactory living standard. It is also fair to say that most people have a limited source of superfluous funds that can be directed into wealth accumulation, especially if one has the responsibilities of providing for a family, food, clothing, shelter, and even more so in the frum Orthodox world, where we have the added burden of tuition payment for children attending a yeshiva or day school. For those who do have extra cash that can be directed into wealth accumulation, there is the question of where to invest, because there are many options, some better than others. The flavor of the month as of 2018 is to invest one's extra cash in digital currency, where over the past 5 or so years there has been an astronomical return on one's investment, when contrasted to the traditional source of investment, where the return ranges between 3 and 12%. As with all high return investments, the greater the return, the greater the risk. And despite the evidence to the contrary, there are many who fear that the money invested in digital currency could quite easily become worthless. Underpinning all investments of the modern era is the concept of financial literacy. Financial literacy is the possession of a set of skills and knowledge that allows an individual to make informed and effective decisions with all of their financial resources. Most people, of course, do not have the time, the energy to obtain the necessary skills, and hence the evolution of a financial advisor who is hired by the investor to advise him or her where best to invest their wealth. In theory, the financial advisor would have the best interests of the investor when giving the advice. However, and especially in the early days, where many banks and financial advisors received commissions from companies that were being promoted as good investments, in other words, the financial advisors were not acting in the best interests of those receiving that advice, in most Western countries, the government has stepped in and regulated the giving of financial advice. But even then, individuals and organizations still succumb to financial scams, both large and small, and when that happens, even if the perpetrator is sent to jail, there's not much that the individual can do to recoup their losses. The high ethical bar that is read into Vayikra 19:14, V'lifnei iver lo titein michshol, whether, as the Torah Kohanim maintain, is a prohibition against providing bad advice that leads to a loss on the part of the individual in terms of health, wealth, or religious commitment and attachment to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, or, according to Rashi, the giving of any advice that is self-serving, that is not in the interests of the recipient, even if the advice in of itself does not result in a negative situation. When the Torah was given, quite understandably, there was not a legislative legal system that could enforce the prohibition of V'lifnei iver lo titein michshol, but there was within the religious world an accountability reflected in the faith statement of Ani Hashem. Throughout the entire Torah, the Ani Hashem is code for a statement made by HaKadosh Baruch Hu that I have the power to hold man accountable. The Ani Hashem in this situation is bolstered by the Vayareta me'elokecha, translated literally as you shall fear God. Rashi, in his commentary, as noted previously, writes, Lefichach, therefore, ne'emar bo, Vayareta me'elokecha, on account of the high bar that is expected by HaKadosh Baruch Hu in man's dealings with others, the narrator adds the words Vayareta me'elokecha, implying that Hamakir machshvatecha, God has the ability to understand and read the thoughts of man, and hence, while it is technically not in the power of the recipient of the advice or by the judges in the law court to determine whether or not the advice was self-serving, within the Torah legal system, one may nevertheless still be held accountable by HaKadosh Baruch Hu if the advice that was given violates the V'lifnei iver lo titein michshol, that the focus of the advice was the needs of the recipient. On the other hand, The Torat Kohanim's reading of the prohibition of lo titein mikshol is a prohibition against giving bad advice. And accordingly, if the recipient who is negatively affected by this advice challenges the giver of the advice, and in the words of the Torat Kohanim, Shema Tomar, the response is that Eitzah Tova ani noten lo. I had no bad intentions, I actually believed that the advice that was given was good. To this comes the response, V'yareta me'elokecha. Ultimately, the veracity will be measured by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and if need be, Ani Hashem, the individual will be held accountable for the loss incurred.